Hello, good morning, good afternoon.
Yes, good morning to us. And I don't know, uh, where do you join from? Is it good morning or good afternoon to you?
For me, it's good morning from Munich.
Oh,
Bon
cool.
dia de Catalunya.
Ah, bom dia.
Through LinkedIn. Good morning from London.
And cultures and intercultural leadership are not always as obviously useful as, let's say, how to use a very good app or how to get the next promotion in your job. So very often intercultural skills are put into this nice to have group of skills. Whereas actually, I think the more virtual, the more digital we go, the more important it is to be culturally flexible. And that is because 100 years ago, when somebody, let's say, wanted to work in India or Singapore or Mexico, they had to spend quite a few weeks on sea. And they could mentally and linguistically and otherwise prepare themselves for the task. And then this went down to a couple of days when somebody, let's say, arrives on a business trip or as an expat to a faraway country. And the virtual sessions reduce this to a couple of minutes. But you are still supposed to go online with two colleagues from India, two from Peru, two from Switzerland, and somehow make things work. So I think I spent a fair amount of my youth researching about colonial officials from Europe in the Far East, as we say it. And I was already quite impressed with how they overcame these difficulties. But if we speed this up to the point where we are today, I think this can be quite daunting. And any skill that you can pick up is quite useful in your daily job. So I'm going to deliver a couple of things about why I think intercultural leadership is so important. And then I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tools and show you how you can use it, even if you don't read the book, buy the coaching, whatever it is. But what are some of the, I don't like calling them tricks, but definitely some practical methodologies that you can help yourself. And then finally, I will also try to pass on a few good habits. We cannot build up, if I work with a management team over, let's say, 3 times 2 days of workshops or months of coaching, then obviously we can build up some new habits. Basically, at a short event, the way I imagine it is that I can help you face in the right direction and then say walk. And we can keep in touch with each other to make sure that as we are walking, of course, we need nourishment, we need encouragement. There will be obstacles, but still the walking direction should be fine. There are 2 ways that we can interact with each other. One is still microphone, because there are not so many people here. So actually, I am Hungarian and I spent a lot of time in interrupting cultures. So I'm fairly used to people just speaking up. I also spent about 20 years in Asia where people don't speak up, but then I just tell them, treat me as family. Because as long as they are family, Chinese or Japanese people have no problem interrupting with each other. It's only in professional environments they have a problem with it. So please speak up if you have a question or if you have a suggestion of how to conduct this session. And then the other one is the chat box, which is usually somewhere down here. I will keep it open. I will watch it, and I will try to respond real time. So please just nod if you can see my slides now. Okay, so first of all, culture shock. As I said, intercultural skills very often bunched through these nice to have kind of skills, which means 2 things. Number one, there are strong believers that there are certain areas of business, especially the ones that have to do with engineering, with law, with finance, with pharmaceuticals, whatever, where culture doesn't matter at all. And I'm going to try to address this claim here. This is number one. And number two, it's also important in terms of prioritizing certain preparations. For example, if you know, or if one of your people know that you as a team we'll have to, let's say, regularly keep in touch with people from different continents, different time zones, different cultures, virtually, in order to achieve some business goals. And then, of course, we have a limited amount of time, and we want to prioritize the skills we need to prepare for this task. And usually, hardcore technical skills always come first. And then comes some legal skills, what we can disclose and what we cannot disclose. Or then there are some other skills about IT, which apps we can use, and so on and so forth. And very often, cultural skills come last, which very often means, in my experience, with even large companies where I work as a coach or consultant, that there is no time or no resources to deliver the intercultural skills. On the other hand, when people go online, and here we are, I'm not talking about face-to-face now, I'm talking about virtual. Here we are, we have started. Let's take one step backwards. We are supposed to make sure that everybody attends, that the right people attend. God forbid, we send some preparation materials already intercultural. And then here we are in the call. Well, who starts speaking? Can you make people speak at all? Do you start with chit-chat or do you start with hardcore business? All of these things are cultural. So if we look at the time alignment of an online call, culture very much comes first. And then in most cultures, actually statistically, the majority of cultures, business comes second. So this is why I think business leaders should care. And by business leaders, I may mean somebody who runs an extended private practice like I do, or a small company or a medium company, or is a CEO for a large multinational corporation like my coaching clients. I believe that before we deliver any skills, we have to look at where you are. So whichever skill that I'm going to focus on is in the limelight at any given moment, there are people around you who are born with that skill. And that means you don't need to train them in that skill. So empathy across people who think in a completely different way, making yourself heard, or assertiveness, being a great listener. All of these skills are more typical for certain cultures than others, but culture is not the only determiner. There are some people who are born great listeners. There are people who are born into the center of attention for one reason or another. So sense of humor, thank you very much. Both personally and culturally, there are huge differences. You make an important speech in Korea or Japan, never start with a joke. So before we deliver any kind of skills, I like looking at where we are right now. And I'm going to ask you one very simple question to get a couple of anchors for this. When I work with management teams as a trainer, we make it a little bit more complicated. We actually start with a sharing session and try to make people feel that an intercultural session is the place where, frankly, you can be a little bit judgmental, you can be a little bit fearful of differences, because if we don't discuss these things at an intercultural session, you are definitely not going to be able to address them at work. Work is a much more high-risk environment than an intercultural session. But also because if you wanted to learn any kind of skill and you would invest your time and energy and sometimes money into it, people would ask you why you do it. And with intercultural skills, it's the same thing. I decided to learn Swahili. Why? I decided to learn to ride the motorbike or a truck. Why is that? I decided to learn a programming language. Why? With intercultural skills, it's the same thing. So this is where I'm going to start. Then we look at a limited set of skills, which is not only true for my short webinars, it's also true for my coaching and training. So I like to limit the number of skills, number of tools, methodologies to the absolute minimum, necessary minimum, which very often is one. Because I think this is what is the easiest to actually integrate into your work and turn into a habit. And then habits, I'm going to talk about them a little bit, but usually at a short session, we don't have time. If I work with somebody over months or years, then it is possible. Okay, could you please answer this question either through the microphone or through the chat module? And notice that the question I'm asking you is not what happened, what was the problem, who were the people, just the question, where were you? So where were you when you experienced the biggest culture shock in your life? And these are usually, biggest culture shock in your life is usually not something that you remember fondly. It's the kind of thing that we can break a little bit of sweat just by thinking about it. Shanghai, China. Okay, you can tell us geographically, or you can also tell us what the environment was. You know, was it a restaurant, and where? Was it a meeting room? Was it like a one-on-one chat when somebody had a sidebar with you and said, you know, what you said in the meeting, that was not cool. Okay, you're not sure? Well, it mustn't have been that shocking if you're not sure. Because usually India, customer visit. Okay, let me see. Business meetings, especially in restaurants, very good. At the introducing meeting in my company, very, very good. All right, I will wait for a couple more seconds in case anything else comes forth, but I think this already gives us some good material. So these are anchors, as I said, and then if you feel comfortable with it, and if you choose to, later you will be welcome to share any of these experiences. But what I can see here, first of all, is geographically it's quite different. Even age-wise, it's quite different. We have strictly professional situations like customer visits. We also have social situations like restaurant or a childhood memory, very good. And also we have this half-half, because, for example, I think introduction meeting is fairly businessy, but a business meeting in a restaurant would be company cafe also is a kind of half-half. Okay, thank you very much for sharing these. I will use these, one more. Many different examples, good. It means that you are aware of making cultural mistakes. Most of them stay under the water. We never find out when we upset somebody culturally most of the time. My father was in the foreign service, but I guess South Korea was the furthest from my family culture. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I was also an expat child. This is one of my roots of interest. I am Hungarian, but I spent about half of my childhood in Baghdad, Iraq. So yes, I mean, you can learn a lot, but you can also sometimes learn the right or the wrong behaviors when you're exposed to different cultures as a child. So I will use all these to anchor my examples to your experiences. Let me see. So this is to counter the fairly prevalent and widespread myth that, you know, Gabor, as I hear sometimes from, let's say, a CFO that I start coaching, this is fantastic. I appreciate that my company puts me through this, but there was this Swiss executive who was going to be commissioned to Singapore, and he told me, I think he was already quite prepared for a culture shock because he worked in Poland for 2 years. Things like this. And also, Gabor, you know, thankfully, I work in a profession, or I work in an area where culture doesn't matter. So I'm an engineer, and the product speaks for itself. I'm a corporate lawyer, and the law is the law, wherever you go. I am a CFO, and money is money. Numbers are not exposed to culture. And then many other areas of life as well. The human body is a human body, you know, and I deal with medical technology, like imaging technology and so on. So I collected these for myself and put them together in these slides, in this one slide. So where does culture appear in unexpected areas? Laws and regulations. Actually, if you talk to lawyers who are trained in intercultural affairs, I worked in the United Nations for a brief period of time. And for example, there are people who are trained in intercultural translation of law, because when you translate a legal code from one language to another, usually the meaning changes a little bit unless you know how to change it back. to the original spirit of the law. So actually, legal codes are very complicated expressions of what a society wants to be. And therefore, they are highly cultural. Now, when you do business in a different culture as a foreigner, actually, you have to bear in mind a couple of things. Of course, you cannot go too deep because you don't have the time. But for example, how you are supposed to do business as a foreigner in that society is usually encoded in the laws of the country. So if I want to compare, in Singapore, if you start a company, you can do business like any Singaporean. But if you start up a company in the People's Republic of China, you have started a foreign invested company. And the legal regulation of that company and you as the legal representative of the company is completely different from an indigenous company started by somebody who is a citizen of that nation. Or the legal status of business. So, for example, if you have religious traditions, social traditions, and you have business, what is the priority, right? Do we do business as a for profit and for development, and social habits supposed to follow business, or is business supposed to support the social habits? Let's say contrast traditional capitalist style banking with halal banking in Muslim countries. So there you can see the priority of the social values. You are allowed to do banking as long as it doesn't violate certain requirements of the society. Let's go on to money, because that's also something that very often we say is free of culture. But what is the risk tolerance, which is a very important thing in investment of the society in general, or the desired risk tolerance of the individual is again something very, very cultural. So in certain societies, let's say in Singapore, you are supposed to take more risk as an entrepreneur than you are supposed to in Japan, let's say. And this is something very closely connected to the core values of the society. We can talk about this a little bit more if you want to. Also, let's say you are supposed to wire $100,000 to somebody. How much exactly do you wire? And what is the margin? If you have done business in many countries, you probably saw that people approach this in many different ways, or who is supposed to pay the fees, and how clearly you have to communicate how much money will arrive, and so on. Not to mention when, and signed by whom, and stamped by whom, and so on. Also, where does smart financial management end and criminal behavior start? Very, very cultural. For years, I trained a global financial transparency and crime hunting organization based in Hong Kong. And we talked an awful lot about this. And it turns out most people who commit certain financial crimes, they are not aware that they committed a financial crime. And this is also very much rooted to how you would behave in your own culture when, let's say, your cousin borrows money from you, or because he wanted to start a business, or how do you interact with your local banker? Very, very different from, let's say, Western Sahara and Switzerland. Culture in marketing. Who and where are your customers? Meaning, in many societies, you would market differently to men and women, old and young, rich and poor, people in the countryside and people in the city. How do you reach out to them? Do you use social media? Do you have to go after them personally, and so on? If you put on a TV commercial, how do you address them? There are languages, for example, where you have two ways of approaching people. One of them are addressing people, one of them polite and one of them less polite. Duzen and sitzen in German, ni and ning in Mandarin. There is represented Spanish, Catalan, you all have these. Which one do you use? IKEA or IKEA, depends on how you pronounce it, famously addresses everybody as a friend. And of course, your investment bank would probably say Sie or Ning if they use German or Mandarin. And then finally in HR, and these are some of my favorite examples. What are you to your team? The World Values Survey, which is one of the most famous intercultural study in the world, asks this question to people. What do you want a boss to be? Is a boss a father? Is a boss like a sports coach? Is a boss just like another team role? And what would you like to be towards the boss? Would you like to be the obedient child? Would you like to be the star player and you just need resources and an opportunity? Would you like to be equal with your boss? And who are the people to each other? Which kind of culture do you build in your organization? I mean, do you want them to be like a band of brothers in war? Do you want them to be like a family? Do you want them to be like a community of strangers who are kept together by the common goal? So many of these things are quite important. And culture shock is when you traverse from one culture to another, which is very often because you either go and physically work in another culture, or you virtually connect with another culture and you're supposed to work there. And suddenly people operate in a completely different way from what you're used to. And this can, as you can see here, come at you from any direction, many of them unexpected. I will stop for a second here in case anybody has any comments or questions. If you want to ask us, just ask us.
Thank you so much. Just to add on to what you were saying, for instance, about marketing, there are so many fantastic examples where marketing has completely failed because they didn't take into consideration culture. So I think these are the examples that we can all learn from, whether we are working in this field or not, just to understand how important it is to take these things into consideration. That's just what I wanted to say.
Yes. I have a video about how multinational companies get Chinese New Year wrong. There I share some of my favorite examples. I don't want to take your time in case somebody is not really interested in this, but of course, lots of great funny examples you can find online about how they named products wrong. For example, there are a couple of Spanish speakers here, why the Mitsubishi Pajero couldn't keep its name in Spanish-speaking countries, but also simply addressing people in the wrong way, like trying to be friends where people don't want to be friends with their local banker, assuming that the parents will buy certain things to the young people, whereas in that society, young people find it very uncool to be spoken to that way, or condescending, and so on and so forth. Absolutely. You can see that I am mapping where we are. We are still with awareness. I'm just going to introduce this very quickly because some of you have followed me for a couple of years, and then I might find like a badly trained parrot saying the same thing over and over again. But this slide stands for a common misunderstanding between cross-cultural and intercultural skills, because a lot of people think, oh, intercultural skills, like how can Germans do business with Japanese? But, whereas this is very, very useful if you are working with a German manager who knows that he will be commissioned to Japan for a few years, or is preparing for a virtual team that he has to lead, and they are all Japanese. But most modern business people today are not exposed to one culture when they leave their home culture. Typically, what happens is that even if you work for a Swiss pharmaceutical company, some of them are my clients, and then they want to send somebody to Shanghai to head up a business unit over there, it's not going to be the Swiss and the Chinese that they are going to work together with. In that branch, in that office, in that team, there are going to be people from different countries, Asian and European, first of all, not to mention that some of their clients are neither going to be Chinese nor Swiss, and suppliers and regulatory bodies, like, for example, they have to be member of an association of pharmaceutical companies, not to mention that China is big enough to host several cultures within the country, not to mention that there are other human factors which separate us culturally: age, gender, technical background, rich and poor, rural and urban, and so on and so forth. So I focus on intercultural skills, which maps certain behaviors, and we can behave constructively using those behaviors across cultures, no matter what they are. So, for example, if you are let's say a Thai executive who is preparing to work in France, then you have to get used to people communicating in a much more straightforward way. But if you're a millennial and you start working with baby boomer top executives, you basically have to brace yourself for the same cultural difference, that people will talk to you in a much more straightforward way. And intercultural skills are very useful this way, because I am using air quotes now, but we are going to do this literally. As long as you can map the difference between the two behaviors, you're fine, and your habits will help you, even if you are not very familiar with that culture. You will just notice, oh, these people are ruthlessly straightforward, and then you can adopt easily, or more easily. Let me put it this way. Okay, so going on to skills, I'm just going to show you that people have tried to understand and measure the amount of culture shock, because obviously if somebody, let's say, if somebody from Israel goes to work in France, is going to have less of a culture shock than going to work in Thailand or Vietnam. So people try to understand the differences for a very long time. And I would like to give you like a quick history lesson in intercultural tools. I don't go back to the big, like, great-grandfather of intercultural skills, Edward T. Hall, although I can share with you a couple of links, and I recommend that you read his books. But Hofstede is Gerd Hofstede and Gerd Hofstede, father and son, are the ones who are mentioned the most when it comes to intercultural skills. And indeed, they put an awful lot of effort into collecting data, mainly in large multinational companies, about how managers behave differently in different countries. But I have two problems with the Hofstede system. One of them is what I call circuit board here. So imagine that not 4 countries or 4 cultures, but let's say you want to remember certain cultural differences between China and the United States. There are very, very few beautiful minds in multinational companies or entrepreneurship who would close their eyes and remember along these factors which country is where. So that's why I said it's a little bit like a circuit board, you know, an engineer understands what's going on there, but the end user doesn't. My other problem with the Hofstede system is it equates nationality with culture, nationality with behavior. So basically it assumes that every German is a typical German, and every Vietnamese is typical Vietnamese, and every Mexican is a typical Mexican. Whereas later research shows that it's a 50-50. So about 50% of the population actually behaviorally suits or fits into the mainstream cultural description of that society, whereas the other half are born mavericks with all other kinds of behavioral traits. So practically they would have a culture shock with their own culture. And this is my case with the culture of my native country, Hungary. I'm not a typical Hungarian at all. Furthermore, those people who are not a good fit with their own native culture are much more likely to end up as expats or international business people. So for our purposes, this is tremendously important, because it's exactly in international business where you don't find the typical Germans and the typical Peruvians and the typical Egyptians. So I'm going on to Erin Meyer's culture map, which is an amazing tool. Basically, the research that Hofstede started and the World Values Survey continued. Erin Meyer, as a researcher at INSEAD, just pulled this data together and put it into a behavioral matrix that was previously used for personal profiles, like DISC and Myers-Briggs. And then she created this very user-friendly map that your academic friends will immediately say it's a simplification, it's not validated enough, and all of this is true. However, you know, now you don't have to understand the physics of the internal combustion engine in order to be able to drive a car or a motorcycle. So if you work with Erin Meyer's culture map and you want to see the amount of culture shock between, let's say, France and Korea, you can just close your eyes and remember where these societies were. And what I do at my workshops is that we turn the entire room into a culture map. And we discuss certain cultures, not necessarily the real culture of the participants, and we make them walk to the relevant corners of the room. And then you remember for the rest of your life where Sakamoto-san was standing, and where Livia was standing, and where somebody from Egypt was standing. I also tell, if you saw some of my videos about this, I create a culture map, I use these pins, and I show a rubber band that the farther you are from each other in the culture map, not necessarily, it almost never reflects the geographic distance. The more severe the culture shock is when you hop between these cultures. Where would you place China on this map? Yeah, so this is an excellent question. Erin Meyer, actually, I discussed this with her. Erin Meyer left out China from this because there was too many subcultures in China. It was difficult to research, but it's somewhere here. So it is an upward triangle with Korea and Japan, perhaps, if I remember correctly, a little bit closer to Korea than Japan. So something like this. You can see my laser pointer. No, Africa, very good point. If you look at later editions, you would find South Africa, Egypt, but not enough research data coming out of Africa, unfortunately. Now, one brilliance of the culture map is now you can literally measure the culture shock, which is the relationship between an individual and the mainstream culture of a society. So now you can create, let's say, a DISC profile or an MBTI profile, and you can compare it. Basically, you can turn the person based on their DISC or MBTI profile into a small avatar and place them into Erin Meyer's culture map. And you might be far away from your native culture, and this is what the Hofstede system couldn't do. Okay, and then now we go on to some of my favorite methodologies. This is the so-called global DISC tool, but also there are other assessment systems. Some of them I am certified in, some of them not, where you can just say, there is Mr. Daniel M. We don't know where he comes from, because even somebody from China could take a English-sounding name. And then the first number, from reading from left to right, the first number is the score, the percentage of this DISC style in the personal profile of Daniel M. And in the brackets, the first number is the same DISC style in the mainstream culture of Iran, and the second number is in the mainstream culture of China. So this way, basically projected down to each DISC style, we can see how big is the like how tight would be the rubber band between Mr. M and these two countries. Usually we create these kind of analysis if either we have to decide whether Mr. M should work in Iran or China, or whether we want to develop Mr. M, who is from one country, into a better executive in the other country, but sometimes just out of curiosity. I mean, last week I trained a German individual who gave me a list of countries with which he would like comparative profiles, and there was no questions asked why he would like to see those. So basically, based on these percentages, you can model not just where the country is in Erin Meyer's culture map, but also where Daniel M would be in Erin Meyer's culture map. Here we are basically measuring the extent or the intensity of culture shock. Same data, but expressed in more like in a Hofstedian language, so to speak. So broken down to individual behaviors, in this case, communication style. And again, this is Frank. This little marine blue avatar is Frank. The baby blue is Germany, and the red is China. We don't choose the color. The system gives us the colors. So you can see that, and it's not a simple picture, because it could happen that in one communication style. Mr. Lin is closer to Germany and the other one is closer to China. It could happen. But it helps a lot when we are dealing with culture shock in the professional world. Now, why should you care? Why is this important? You will, I mean, if you have a keen eye, you will discover differences between Eremeyer's culture map and the global disk style graph. That is because different researchers interpret the data differently and therefore sometimes put certain mainstream cultures in a different quadrant. So for example, China, Japan would be square green for Eremeyer, but here it's somewhere between green and blue, so between the two quadrants. But why is this important? And now I'm getting to the end of my sharing session, and we will switch over to discussion very soon. Poor culture fit could hit your productivity in ways you don't expect. And this is what in my forthcoming book, this year I'm going to publish a book called Dragon Suit, which is based on about 50 interviews with high-level executives, usually C-suite, from Western countries, but in China. They usually expect something like, okay, you know, when I delegate to people, I will get a different behavior in response, and I will have to learn table manners, but you know, nothing that some reading up on the local culture wouldn't fix. On the other hand, they enter something that in the book I call the baby boss phase, when to their great horror, they find out that they have to relearn absolutely basic skills. And this is why so many of you mentioned restaurants when I asked you about the biggest culture shock in your life, because that's one of those places where you can make a complete idiot out of yourself and lose even your professional credibility. Obviously, if you are trying to learn to eat with chopsticks or a fork and knife, or you absolutely have no idea how to behave in a social situation like this, it will be very difficult to seriously discuss business as well. But people have to relearn how to dress up in the morning, how to enter a meeting room, where to sit down, what to say first, how to sit in a chair. You know, there are certain unacceptable ways of sitting in a chair in many countries. And this puts people into this state of constant mild irritation. And if you know a little bit about the workings of the human brain, it makes your amygdala fire constantly, although at a, how do you say, at a low intensity. But that kills your focus. It burns energy at alarming rates. You get tired in 3 hours in the office instead of your usual 9-hour working days. You get impatient, you get snippy. And then this happens exactly when you usually pick up a new intercultural assignment and you're supposed to be sharper than usual. So this can easily turn into a vicious circle. If we move on to my third bullet point, it is part of human nature, it is provenly part of human nature to blame culture when somebody doesn't understand you. So let's say I'm surrounded by colleagues from India, I'm telling them something, nobody understands what I'm trying to say. It is very easy to blame culture and say, well, they don't understand because they are Indians, aren't they? I mean, they don't come from the same cultural background. They didn't have the same education. Once I was called to help a Chinese and an Indian team work better with each other on the linguistic front. Language can get very, very personal very fast. So to simplify the discussion between the two management teams, it looks like this. Chinese team, sorry, Indian colleagues, but we simply don't understand your accent of English. Indian team, then you really should get your act together because we are native speakers and you are not. And you can see how quickly the interaction between these two groups can be ruined, and it can become defensive and become conflictual. And if you go down this road, you can burn out surprisingly quickly and may not even admit that it's a cultural problem. Let me spin this around because there are good news. And what happens when that rubber band is relatively loose or the cultural adaptation is faster? So this is, I don't know if you have ever been in that situation that you were in a foreign culture, even if you just visited a foreign city for a couple of weeks, and suddenly you felt at home. And people there in the street, they talk to you the way you always wanted people to talk to you. And the food was to your taste, and even the climate was to your taste, and you could be yourself and it was appreciated. You didn't try to be polite, you didn't try to look smart, impress anybody, and you got positive feedback. And this is a good culture fit. It can be natural or it can be learned, but this is how you feel. You suddenly feel lighter. Also, you make friends easier. I don't know, people invite you to project teams. They promote you easier and so on. So this is what I call a support network. One of the tragedies of working across cultures is that suddenly you don't understand the legal system. You don't understand the financial system. And the people you called before when you had this kind of problem, they cannot help you. Because your mentor who always helped you with legal issues happens not to know anything about Indonesian law. In a good culture fit, you very quickly build up your support network and recreate the same situation as you had in a culture that you were already familiar with. And this, in turn, helps you to rebuild your confidence. It's just the opposite of the baby boss phase. Yeah, I can do this. Well, yeah, I guess I am a smart guy. Yes. In some East Asian countries, people have the habit of expressing, if they appreciate somebody, they say you're handsome or you're beautiful. In some Mediterranean cultures, we do the same. So I was at KUKA, the robotics company. I think it was actually yesterday. And there are some European managers who asked me, why did this Chinese manager tell me I was handsome on a Zoom call? It's actually an expression of appreciation, but of course, nobody minds being called handsome. So it adds to your positive energy, and then you become more dynamic, and then people notice, and then you build your professional reputation and you get more opportunities. So either a vicious circle or a virtuous circle, depending on. And this is why culture shock is so tremendously important in business. Very quickly, and this is the end of my sharing sessions. What can we do? What is like a quick list? Obviously, this webinar is not about solutions. It's more about what is culture shock and why you should care. But I would still like to bring you a couple of things. Awareness, skills, and habits. So, awareness. Try to figure out, and the best way to do this is to get like a sidekick who is from that culture. So if you are sent to a country you don't know, try to make friends with somebody who's either from the local culture or somebody who is not from local culture but has been there for a long time, speaks the language, has strong social ties there. And most cultures appreciate discussing sensitive issues one-on-one rather than in groups. And use that person as an opportunity to have these little sidebars, you know, like when I said this and that, people acted weirdly. Why was that, do you think? Because the professional and the personal is separated in different ways in different cultures. The corporate and the national, so to speak, you know, are we proud of this product because it is Chinese, or are we proud of this product because it was delivered by this company? And lots of others. And also, I always tell people this, when you try to be familiar with a new culture, when you try to learn about it, when you try to test your intercultural skills, it's better not to start with groups. It's better to start with individuals. Even if you are on the opposite side, there is like this faceless project team of 7 names and no cameras. Close your eyes, listen to people, try to pick the ones who use a similar tone, a similar communication style that you like. And try to make friends with them. Try to make them your primary contact in the other culture. And then when it comes to skills, I usually introduce these tools, teams, transfer, which means first look at how you can do something better. Then you look at how you can get help from others. And only then, if you still feel very uncomfortable, try to make a sideways move or relocate or something like this. So tools means Jeremiah's culture map, reading about Global Disk, and also creating processes. So for example, are you working in a culture that takes personal relations very seriously, but you come from a culture where it's okay to forget the birthday of your employees? Set reminders. Do you come from a culture where usually people have breakfast together in the canteen and you go to a culture where people don't? Then figure out how to create a process where either you can initiate a group breakfast or you just invite a couple of trusted people to that breakfast. Team, it means, okay, you tried, the tools still don't solve the problem. Then you usually have to get some kind of help. If you're a leader, your direct reports are a very good source. They will appreciate you choosing them as your trusted person and confidentially asking them about cultural issues, one-on-one. They will appreciate it. High-level executives hesitate to do that because they don't want to look weak. They don't want to look like a loser. And then I usually ask them, if your boss asked you about these issues, how would you feel? And usually they would feel proud. Almost nobody tells me, well, I would think they are a gigantic loser. Also superiors, I mean, a little bit trickier, but still possible. And you can just get a mentor from your company or pick a mentor. Just ask somebody, could you help me with these kind of issues? And I would say only after that, professional helpers like myself, human resources, coaches, legal advisors, whatever. But you have lots of people around you who have a lot of the data that you need. And only then transfer. And when we say transfer, I first say, don't think about going to another location or business unit. Think about first to rewrite your job description. So building trust with others is not my strong suit. How can I take the trust building element from my job description and share it with somebody else and just keep, let's say, the hardcore technical stuff, work together with them in a team? Maybe I can ask my company to put me in a slightly different functions, to be the data guy in the project and not the communication guy. Or I want to be the stakeholder engagement person, and I want to give the technical bit a rest. Okay, 2 quick things about habits, because today's time is too little for habits. Number 1, experience doesn't equal potential, which means just because you're a seasoned, experienced manager and even have experience working in different countries, it doesn't mean you will succeed in your next position. Because the next culture will be so different that, you know, even though you did very well in Poland, Russia, and Israel, you can fail in Thailand. So that's why mapping cultures and mapping the amount of culture shock is so very important. And please remember that when you are under mild pressure, and culture shock tends to do that with you, you usually revert to your old habits. So former smokers, you know, when they are in a stressful situation, that's when they really, really need a cigarette. If you gave up sugar, you will eat a cookie when somebody makes you upset. And culture shock is the same thing. Did you learn empathy and mindfulness and you are doing okay? They make you upset, you will raise your voice. Expect that and create some mechanisms for overcoming it. It's the amygdala. So just a couple of pictures, you know, to build my credibility with you. Sessions in China, Pakistan, Germany, India. I'm a learner though. I learn something new every day and I'm constantly trying to sharpen my methodology. I will leave this on because I have this so-called speed coaching session. And if you're interested in it, basically what I do is it's an assessment and 2 hours of coaching, very, very sharply focused on one specific issue. Usually managers just sign up if they know exactly what cultural or leadership challenge they want to overcome. About 1/3 of the time is just the start, and 2/3 of the time we manage to deliver something that actually helps them and they can turn it into habits. Last week, I had a very interesting session about a technical executive expressing himself on paper or in emails to high-level human resources executives or clients. I believe in the necessary minimum amount of tools and focusing very, very sharply on specific issues and specific people. I will stop sharing because I think that helps discussion. And of course, absolutely, I hope that there will be further questions through the chat or through the microphone.
Yes, and okay, then let me do the start. So thank you very much for sharing these many years of your experience and how you do things, and for being so open I think I always like to see things from a different perspective. So this has fully met my expectations.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is obviously you are working a lot in Asia, and when there is management coming, of course they will not speak the language. And of course there are other assignments in this world where people will speak the language. How much of an impact on the cultural shock does this make?
Well, it makes an enormous difference. The first thing that would come to my mind is that speaking a foreign language, it already reflects a certain level of interest in that language and culture, which helps. So, you know, if I go to a Russian-speaking environment, having learned Russian, it means at least I didn't skip those classes in school. But probably it means I put my energy into it. So there is the sunk cost part. You know, once I learn the language, I would like to use it. But there is also the interest part. It's like, finally, I can really go to a Russian tea house and talk to the waiters in Russian. So motivation is everything. You know, that if you're motivated to learn, it raises your tolerance. It raises the level of your proactiveness. It shields you from that kind of amygdala panic that turns us into this kind of unbearable expat. And then comes the objective part that you understand the street names, you can take a peek at documents, so you are going to be much more compatible with the professional culture, but also that you look more approachable to the local population, right? So I spoke basic Chinese when I arrived in China, and then people were much more willing to invite me into their homes. Otherwise, it's awkward for them to bring a foreign speaker home, and obviously the family doesn't speak that foreign language. So also the integration goes much quicker. I'm just going to read. This is so different from the intercultural work and training I have done. My work is trust building and intercultural dialogue facilitation. Thank you very much for the question in the question. So I will, how do you say, I would deliver my philosophy very, 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 very easily. When you do an intercultural session for university students or for an NGO or let's say a YouTube video, there the primary goal is to reduce friction, reduce conflict, help the two sides build empathy towards each other. But unfortunately, in leadership and business, it's not. Actually, the primary goal is to deliver the business goal. And then less friction and empathy are tools. And you can easily bounce over to a level of empathy and alignment where you are best friends, but you cannot deliver. I have seen this many, many times. You can, especially in Asia, you can avoid conflict, but at the expense of efficiency and effectiveness. So that's why, as an intercultural leadership consultant, I have to balance these two things very, very carefully. Otherwise, what happens very often is that Asian managers who are indirect communicators to start with, they become even more indirect to avoid conflict. And for business, and especially for resources like time, that's not always good. So if you achieve things by building empathy, fine. If you build so much empathy that it is at the expense of your effectiveness, then we have to look at it in a different way. No stereotype is always helpful. That's why there are stereotypes. Absolutely. So that's why I personally profile all the people who go through my programs. And yeah, let's look at the color of your passport. You are Chinese, you are Thai. We will assume that you are a more indirect communicator than a French or a British manager, but this is an assumption that is 50-50, according to research. You might be in the 50% that is in alignment with the mainstream culture of your country. You may be in the other 50%. The other 50% are the best cultural connectors. So the relatively straightforward Thai managers, the relatively indirect German managers, the relatively good listener French people, the relatively, and so on and so forth, because they are temperamentally out of the mainstream. So they connect more easily with cultures which are similar from their own culture. I am one of these people. And if you use either assessment or you use workshops where you basically just discuss typical behaviors, then you can find the people who can play more naturally play. Everybody can play the cultural connector if you get the right skills, but some people will be happier to play it because temperamentally they are very well suited for that role. And Jörn, did I fully answer your question? Because there was
yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And maybe I can just quickly ask my second question. We talked about culture shock. Do you also work with people that return to their home country?
Yes.
And is there something you do so that the transition is easier?
Yes. These days, I obviously work an awful lot with Western executives who return from China. First of all, because there is an outward flow of expats from China. Some of them go on to other, actually, a large proportion go on to other Asian locations, but many of them, willingly or otherwise, they go back to their Western countries. And also, I work with Asian executives who return to their Asian countries after an extended stay in the West. And there are different kind of challenges. There are the personal challenges to you as an individual, a kind of reverse culture shock to your native culture. But also there are the integration challenges, because some societies, after you have been out of that country for 10 years, they give you a little bit of resistance blending back in, so to speak. Let me give you an example. In technological industries like automotive, pharmaceutical, IT, robotics, and so on, people who worked in Japan or China for, let's say, 10 years, they learn an awful lot, because these societies, in many specific technological areas, they are half a decade, 1 decade ahead of many European countries. But when you move back to Switzerland or Germany or Italy, and you say you have a lot to learn from China, your typical colleagues just hate hearing that. And this is something that these managers have to deal with, both psychologically and in terms of pure communication skills. Societies like Japan, for example, if you have been out of the country, you kind of reprogrammed yourself a little bit, and then you are not so compatible with some very, very strict social standards of Japanese society anymore. So this kind of returning foreigners very often find themselves a little bit excluded, both professionally and socially. This is also something that you can work with. And then the solutions are actually very much the same. Build a very strong awareness of what's happening, and then pinpoint the cultural adaptation skills which will create the biggest impact in the shortest possible time. Not only because that will give you the motivation to grow further, but also because that sends a very loud and clear message to your environment that you're ready to take a step towards them, and they will welcome that as well. And I will read the short question first and the long one second. There are so many variables at play, and that is absolutely true. But that's why I always talk about human nature in terms of how do you say, it starts with the gut. It starts with our personality and the values that we bring from childhood, from our parents, from our educators, because those core values, if the going gets tough and there is a little bit of pressure, they trump skills that we learned later. It's as easy as that. That's why, for example, if from a fairly introverted society like Japan or Thailand, we are looking for better cooperation with extroverted societies like, let's say, Arabic-speaking countries or Mediterranean countries or South America, we first look at people who are temperamentally flexible and extroverted. Because that is so much easier, that you can be like flying geese, you know? Of course, everybody else has to build a better cooperation, but that person can break the ice and find the best ways to work together. Also, you have to anticipate this. No matter how well you learned cultural adaptation skills and intercultural leadership skills, They put you under pressure, you will revert to some of your bad habits. You have to anticipate it. You have to learn how to communicate it to others. Sorry, I'm being such a nuisance right now because I'm under pressure and this is what comes out of me. And what the next step is. Is it tool? Is it a certain communication soundbite? Is it team? Oh, in this case, I would like Lucy to communicate for me, or is it something else? Fairly long, but I will still try to read it out in entirety. As an international business consultant, the most difficult part for me is to convince customers that they need intercultural training. They always think that they can get by with the language. I live in France, language, yes. How would you answer the question, why would I need that? I'm intercultural chameleon, so it seems very obvious to me, but I don't seem to be able to. Yes. I don't want to do this literally, but I would mentally go back to that slide about where culture appears. So just listen to the person who gives you this opinion and listen to them why they think intercultural skills are not so important. And they will give you the key words where culture appears. So they will say things like engineering, machines, IT. They are not culturally dependent. But please, self-driving vehicles are programmed and behave differently depending on which country they were produced and programmed in. And they do experiments like this. They test cars from the behavior of the car. An expert can tell whether this is a Chinese or a German code. Financial processes look different for the same multinational company in different countries. So please, if you think you don't need intercultural skills, you are just looking for culture in the wrong place, basically, right? So why is it that the Thai branch of exactly the same Swiss company wires money 3 days later than, let's say, the American branch? Why is it that if you write literally the same thing in an email and you send it to a French manager, they will reply in what looks like fairly aggressive in many different cultures, and why somebody from Japan writes you one page, which is amazingly polite but says nothing, and why from, let's say, your Chinese branch, you will just hear nothing. Why is that? And then we highlight a couple of these things. So of course, this is a very long answer to a long question, but I think where culture appears in these kind of seemingly objective areas of businesses is very, very important. And let's keep in touch. I would be very happy to give you specific examples I'm not going to share here. Okay, I'm finding all this stereotyping counterproductive. Stereotyping looks like this. Research shows that half of the people born in a certain society display the mainstream behavioral elements of their culture. And that's why stereotyping exists. Because it's a 50-50, but the 50% is fairly similar to each other, and the other 50% goes all over the place. So that's why when we go to a foreign place, we pick up on the 50%. So let me give you an interesting example. You are a tourist and you are hungry, but you don't want to sit down for a meal because you do your sightseeing. You buy something like a granola bar, or you buy some pastry in a wrapper, and you eat it on the go, and you admire the scenery in the city. And then you finished your eating and you have the crumbled up wrapper in your hand. Is it okay to find the closest rubbish bin and throw it away? And very often the closest rubbish bin is something that would be outside of like a residential building or a private home. And then very soon, if you spend a week in that country, you learn if it's okay or not okay. So for example, if I'm in Osaka, and there is a rubbish bin outside of a home for collection, and I just go there and I put my rubbish in, the owner of the house or somebody from the house will run out and tell me to remove it. Whereas in another place, it's completely okay and wouldn't even notice it. So those rules are for the 50% mainstream. This is how people build a society. This is why the legal system is an expression of what the society is supposed to be and how individuals should behave. Now, we hate a lot of these conventions in our own society. And the more of these conventions we hate in our own society, the more likely it is that we are fit, how do you say, we belong to the other 50%, which is not typical for our society. Many of those people end up in unconventional professions or unconventional places. I can see that some of you have to leave now. So I would like to thank you very, very much for being here, including those of you who are not here already. I'm always very happy to hear how you apply this at real work. So please drop me a line. You go to holch.biz or one of my websites. There are many Holches in the world, and there are many Gabors in the world, but there is only one Gabor Holch, so it's easy to find me online. If you use the contact bar of my website, I get it as an email. I would be very happy to engage in any kind of conversation. I restarted my monthly webinar, so I very, very much hope that I will see you again very soon. And yeah, you know, people in my line of business love it when they get an email or a comment or anything. And I really hope that some of this will turn into habits and will help you.